Episode 4, A Shock for Smiths. As Bessie was leaving along with the letter, she heard someone's voice, but then she decided to ignore and move along. "Where's Bessie going?" Anne said. "Actually, she just has to admit her fault. It's no big..." Thomas suddenly said, "She's not lying." David, Anne, and the rest did not quite understand him. Thomas recalled the seal on the envelope as he fidgeted with his rosary. "That was Principal Eric White's personal seal. I've seen it before when I was in the student union." Suddenly, everyone went silent. David had not said a thing, but he was stunned as well. Grace was in shock as she tried to process what he was saying. David asked, "Are you implying that Bessie knows the principal of Brightbow High School? How could she have a connection with him, and why would he wish to have a student like Bessie in his school?" The shock wasn't easy to process. Without waiting too long, Anne grabbed her bag and mumbled something under her breath before heading out the door for school. At Brightbow High School, in the principal's office, an elderly man was sitting at his desk. His clothes were neat and tidy, and behind his glasses were the eyes of a highly intelligent man. A woman and a slightly older man entered the office. The woman politely greeted, "Principal White." Her brows were messy, her eyes dull, and her lips curving downwards at the tips. She looked pretty unpleasant and was evidently a curt woman. This was the teacher in charge of Class 3.1, Catherine Lewis. She was the only female teacher in charge in the whole of Brightbow High School. Principal White put his pen down and looked at Bessie sitting in the corner with her leg propped up rudely. "Teacher Lewis, this student over here, I'd like for her to join your class." Principal White put it very succinctly. It was rare to see students join the school only in 9th grade. Mrs. Lewis received the 2 sets of files and narrowed her eyes when she saw the previous grade slips. "She's going to be a full-time student here, and her grades are going to be entered into the school system." Mrs. Lewis was firmly against it. "You're just tossing crap into my class. She'll ruin the entire class atmosphere. Principal, you've got to be kidding me." "Mrs. Lewis, there's a student present here. Watch your words." The middle-aged man beside her frowned. This man was slightly plump and had small eyes. He always seemed to have a smile on his face. His name was Stephen Scott, and he was the teacher in charge of 9th grade. Mr. Scott figured out that this girl sitting in the corner was probably the student they were discussing. It wasn't nice to be called crap so openly. "Mr. Scott, you're in charge of a mainstream class. Of course it's easy for you to talk. What if we put her in your class instead? Would you be this calm?" The class she took was the special stream. They were all the top 100 students in the school. Mrs. Lewis wanted to be awarded as one of the Chicago's 10 most outstanding teachers, and there was only one slot for their area. If she had to take in a student that would potentially pull her class down, it would lower her chances. "If this was my student, I'd definitely be responsible for her." Mr. Scott had always been disapproving of the way she treated students differently based on their aptitudes. Principal White remained silent in his seat. He simply glanced at Bessie in the corner, trying to figure her out. Bessie looked up at him indifferently. She looked so unfazed by everything and was practically unreadable if one could not detect the hint of rebellion and stubbornness. Principal White looked away. He propped his glasses up and gestured for Mrs. Lewis to hand the files to Mr. Scott. "Mr. Scott, would you be willing to take this student?" Mr. Scott skimmed through her history and felt a spark inside him. He wanted to save this lost girl. Seeing that Mr. Scott agreed to it, Mrs. Lewis heaved a huge sigh of relief. Bessie carried her bag and followed Mr. Scott, a slender figure shadowing the slightly plump man. When he asked her a question, she gave short answers. Her tone was calm and unbothered. What an obedient and pleasant-looking student, Mr. Scott thought to himself. Mrs. Lewis walked in front of the 2 of them, her heels clicking away. She didn't look at Bessie, but rather swept a glance at Mr. Scott and sarcastically said, "No wonder why Mr. Scott hasn't been making much progress even after 20 years in this career." To that, Mr. Scott simply smiled at Bessie. "Bessie, don't give up. There's one more year. Everything is possible." Bessie nodded. "Poofed." Mrs. Lewis side-eyed Bessie, barely concealing her disdain. Mr. Scott must have gone mad. With that, she strutted off. Mrs. Lewis is like this all the time. She teaches our class English. Mr. Scott furrowed his brow and tried to ignore Mrs. Lewis as he took Bessie to get her uniform and books. Bessie asked him where the school doctor's office was. The two of them conversed as they walked. Mr. Scott was genuinely worried. Her grades were simply too bad. He had no idea how to start helping her.
Mr. Scott, please wait.
Principal White's voice could be heard from the back.
I have an exam script here. Please have it marked.
At first glance, he saw the words, their postures vertical and leaning on each other. The ink changed in thickness freely, and the words were an unrestrained vigor of strokes. It was a form of willfulness and lack of restraint from the inside out. Even across a paper, Mr. Scott could almost see how the person who had written the paper held the pen. That person was cool and wild, with an unrestrained madness. The Mathematical Olympiad question was from last year's Mathematical Olympiad and was not available online. Mr. Scott had studied this set of papers last year, and so he scanned through it quickly. A large part of the problem-solving answers was different from the solutions he had read before, but the general direction was right. There were not many questions on the paper, but Mr. Scott looked at it for a long time.
I don't know much about the Olympiad, but I wanted you to help me look at how that kid is doing.
Principal White poured a cup of tea for Mr. Scott and passed it to him. Mr. Scott took the cup and didn't drink it immediately. He just held the paper and looked at it for a long time.
Principal White, who did this? A student in our school?
Principal White did not answer. He took the teacup and asked softly, sighing.
Was it done well? It's more than good,
Mr. Scott said, with a regretful tone tinged with curiosity.
If I had seen this student 2 years earlier, the gold medal would have been ours.
Principal White smiled and did not answer. Mr. Scott could not help but ask again.
Is this person from our school?
The best students in math were Kenneth White from their class and Thomas, who had graduated earlier. However, they couldn't even compare to the person who did this paper. If this person was in their school, they would be able to hit a new high. But it didn't seem possible, as he couldn't have not known about it, and the name of that exceptional student remained a mystery. Bessie went to the school's medical office. There was a very simple gray door that was half opened. Not far away, a group of girls in PE class frolicked with each other and looked at the school medical office. There seemed to be some treasure there. Samuel Bright touched the shining studs on his left ear. He smiled and dismissed the 23rd girl this morning before smirking at Michael, who was lying on the sofa.
Your market price is just as in the past.
Michael pulled the blanket over his face.
Shut up. Don't make noise.
Samuel mimicked a zip over his mouth. He looked up.
This girl looks good.
Samuel quickly changed his position and made a pose. He held his black gel pen, said hello casually before saying rudely,
Where are you uncomfortable?
Bessie looked over at him at the medicine in the cupboard. Is there a sleeping pill? Her voice was neither cold nor warm.
Sleeping pill?
There had been many girls who had asked for medicine just to see Michael, and she was the first one to come here genuinely for medicine. Samuel felt that it was very rare.
The sleeping pills are prescription drugs. I can't give them to you.
A sudden, low voice interrupted him.
How many?
Samuel turned his head suddenly. Michael's long, clean fingers stopped on the box containing sleeping pills and looked up at Bessie. 10, said Bessie while staring at the box of pills. Michael nodded. He counted 10 pills, wrapped it in white paper, and handed it to Bessie. She took it. She didn't expect the transition to be so smooth. She thanked him and slowly put the medicine away. Her face was so beautiful, but her delicate eyebrows couldn't conceal her personality. Michael looked at her sideways and suddenly smiled.
You're welcome, but the prescription drugs need to be signed,
he said. He pushed a list over. Bessie held a pen with her left hand and signed it. Michael looked down at the written name. Bessie. When she left, Samuel asked,
Do you know her?
Michael narrowed his eyes slightly and smirked.
Thin waist.
Huh? Michael stopped talking.
Is there something going on?
Samuel stroked his chin and smiled wretchedly. Michael looked at the ugly handwriting on the medical record and said lightly,
I'm a doctor in the school. This is my duty.
Samuel said, Did this thought strike you now? A group of girls pushed the gray door open. Samuel looked at Michael, turned back, then he said 3 casual words.
Don't make noise.
Samuel said nothing. He looked in the direction where Bessie was leaving. Other than being especially pretty, he couldn't see anything special in her, and her handwriting was so ugly it was a little cute. Mr. Clark couldn't possibly throw away all the noble ladies chasing after him in the city and fancy that girl, could he? In English class, the fishes and dragons were mixed together. In the last row, a youngster leaned on the table and whispered, "Kenneth, I've asked around. The class president was unhappy in the morning because of her sister. Just why on earth would Uncle Smith put her in our school and make our class president feel awkward?" He rubbed his chin and said, "I heard that she took a year off school just to quarrel. What an angry soul she must be, right?" There were also other school bullies, but most of them looked fierce as compared to the new girl. The youngster tittered. "It seems like she has come to Chicago and wants to enter high school because of Anne." Kenneth took out his notebook and threw it on the table with a slam. He said lightly,
A painting of a tiger turned out to be a dog.
They were yet to ring the school bell. Mr. Scott had entered the class early and was beaming with joy.
Today, we have a new member joining us in our English class. Everyone welcome her.
The mystery behind the brilliant student who solved the Olympiad paper remains unearthed. Will Grace and Smith's family come to terms with the fact that Bessie had made it to the prestigious school of Chicago? Will Bessie be able to adjust and hone a few skills in first middle school?